like a little bit nervous. Like maybe I'm a bit rusty. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I know we've got a lot of your community with us, but we also have a lot of ours. So Design Cuts community, could we give like the warmest Design Cuts welcome to Loish? Because we definitely don't want you to feel nervous. It's like such a friendly bunch here, and we're going to have some fun today. You know, even I felt nervous. I do these all the time, and there's so many like cool people showing up. I'm like, oh wow, I feel the nerves.
Yeah, it's always a thing when you get up in front of people, like virtually or in real life. There's always like this part of me that's like, oh no, like I really
Yeah.
can't mess up right now, even though I almost always mess up during live demos. So we'll see how it goes. Just got to go with the flow.
It's all the fun of live. We'll figure it out. But first of all, thank you so much, by the way, for joining. I know we've been planning this for a while, and I'm really grateful that you're here because, as I said to the community, I'm a huge personal fan of your work. A lot of our team are as well. They kind of freaked out, and I was like, "No, she's joining us finally." So yeah, we just appreciate you being here.
Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation, and I am like blown away by the community and the number of people who showed up and all of the super excited messages. Like I'm just having a great time like picking up the vibes here. So thank you for having me.
The vibes are fantastic. I feel
Yeah, they're
slightly bad for
immaculate.
Fran. Yeah, right? That's what the kids say these days, right?
Yes, yes.
I feel slightly bad for Fran, wonderful Fran on our teams in the chat with everyone, and it's moving so quick. I'm
Yeah,
like, okay,
where
good luck,
messages
Fran.
keep
Like,
getting
yeah,
whisked away.
indeed. But yeah, we're going to share some cool things today. I think there is a handout as well. If you've missed that, everyone, click on the handouts just in the top right, and that's a really cool download of brushes that Loish put together for us. So thank you for that. But without further ado, over to you. I'm super excited to learn.
The scary part. Okay. All right. So let's see if the screen sharing works first of all. Let's go. Hold on a second. Share.
Sure.
Is it sharing?
Often there's like a little delay, but hopefully. I seriously think there's like so many people
Oh, there we
that
go.
the system's working a little slower than normal.
All right. It's on my end. It says that it's sharing. So let me know when you see it.
I can't see it yet, but we have the lovely cat behind the scenes just making sure everything runs smoothly. And yeah, I think everyone's grabbing the handout right now as well, which is cool. So yeah, the cat's just messaging. There we go. Okay.
It's working.
I think the internet is just trying to give me anxiety today, honestly.
It picks up, technology picks up on your vibes, you know, like the more you need something to work, the more it kind of like messes with you.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of situations where my computer like seems to be broken, and then I get so frustrated, and then the next day I come back well rested and calm and everything works again. So I don't know.
It's directly correlated. I hear. By the way, how was your vacation? Was it good?
Oh, it was amazing. It was just I shared a lot of it over on Instagram. So if you want to know how it was, like I have some story highlights on there. But yeah, it was a lot of like adventures. I have a lot of like new landscapes that I need to integrate into my art. Like I'm going to be doing some studies because we went into the mountains. So I love that.
Incredible.
Like the sense of heights and the but today we'll be drawing people. So for now, I'm going to get back into character art, which is my comfort zone. I believe that I provided a reference image, and I think that you guys can get this reference image as well if you want to draw along from the same one. But this is the reference image that I provided. And the session is going to be about making a stylized portrait from a reference. So basically starting off from something like this as our jumping off point, and then creating something kind of stylized on that. And I got a lot of questions about that, right? So I got a lot of people asking me, how do I divert from a reference image and make it different from like what I see in front of me? So that's what I'll be talking about a little bit. I think a lot of people in the chat are asking where the reference is. So maybe you could let them know where they can get it.
Yeah, absolutely. It should hopefully be in one of the handouts. But if we could clarify that, Fran, that would be awesome, please. But we will make sure that everyone has that with them. Hopefully it is part of the downloads being provided there.
And otherwise, I'm going to be keeping the reference image like in view the whole time that I'm drawing. So you can also draw from my screen because I'm going to be having it next to my canvas. So I'll be like setting that up right now. So I have like on one half my reference image and over here I'll be drawing. So
Perfect.
that's
I think the handout was brushes only, Lois, but people can maybe screen grab the reference if that works.
Well, then I'll just put it up again for a second. So if you want to screen capture the reference image, I'd say, let's zoom in. There we go. So I'm just going to be using this as my starting point. And one thing I think that's really important about stylization as a concept. So stylization is basically like when you have something that you're drawing and you push it towards a certain kind of style that is away from realism. So it's sort of like the opposite of a realistic approach, right? You're not drawing exactly what you see, but you're kind of modifying and adjusting it towards a certain kind of stylistic approach. And I think a lot about stylization is about how can you change what you see in front of you. And I always think that a really good starting point for that is thinking about like what captures your attention when you're looking at a reference image. So what is it about the reference image that that catches your eye? And I think it's really good to use your intuition, to figure that out. So just looking at it and just seeing what comes up. Like, what do you notice? What are the first things that you pick up from the image? Because that's something you can build on for your stylization technique. So for example, when I look at this image, I'm going to kind of draw over it, but let's pick a good color, something like blue. So when I look at this image, what really draws my attention, for example, are her features. So there's a kind of like slight angularity to it, to her eyebrows and the shape of her eyes and the corners of her mouth. And those are things that I notice. And I think like, okay, maybe pushing that angularity could be a good starting point for a stylized approach. And other things you can think about are like the overall shapes, like she has kind of a round face. So that could be a starting point as well. And you could push the roundness in other elements. And I think a huge part of creating stylized art is looking for reference images that inspire you and taking the time to kind of figure out what it is that you like about it, what it is that you want to push further in your version. So don't jump straight into the drawing process. Take a little bit of time to reflect on it and look at it and think about which elements draw your attention the most. And another thing that I like about stylization is that everybody can take a different stylization approach. So one person's stylized interpretation can look different than another person because it comes down to how you perceive and what draws your attention first. And for every person, that will be different. So I think stylization is such an important way to not only create interesting art, but also show your personal interpretation and your own vision of how you see the world. So it's a way of creating your own kind of visual language, basically, that shows how you see things. And that's why I love talking about stylization. All right,
does it tend to be stuff that just catches your eye? So it's like whatever kind of looks most pleasing to you?
Yeah, I also, for example, with this one of the reasons why I really like this reference image is because her expression is a little bit ambiguous. It's kind of like in between expressions, right? So she's not really happy or really sad or laughing or frowning. It's kind of in the middle. And that always appeals to me because you can then fill in your own interpretation of the expression, or you can push it into the direction that fits your own mood, for example. But that's something that always kind of I'm naturally drawn towards. So I think it's really good when you're looking for reference to collect images that you feel naturally drawn towards for whatever reason, because that's something you can build on in developing your own style.
Perfect.
Are we good to go for drawing? Is everybody ready to go?
Yeah. Let us know in the chat if you're ready to to kick off drawing. And don't worry, by the way, whatever software you're in, like I know many of you might be in Procreate, you're going to be able to follow along and like learn so many techniques today.
Yes, this should be applicable to any kind of drawing software. So Photoshop is my comfort zone in terms of software, but you can easily replicate the same workflow in any other drawing software. The most important thing that you need is just to be able to use brushes, use layers, and to set those layers to different modes. But I think that that's like what you'll find in most drawing programs. So we should be good to go.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so I'm gonna start by taking my brush. So I use a brush called the Macalabs HB pencil brush, and that's just like my favorite sketching brush that I found online once. And the thing that I really like about this brush is when I set it to a lower flow, you get like really soft lines basically. And I feel like that's always a good place to start because it's so important not to get stuck on the details in the early stage, because then your mind will start going towards whether things are correct, like whether you're getting them right or not. And when you're making stylized art, it's really important not to think too much about right and wrong and more about like just what's working. And you don't have to know exactly why it's working. You just have to kind of like look at it and assess for yourself whether it feels right. So it's more intuitive. And working with a kind of bigger, looser brush allows me to move away from the detail and the correctness of the drawing and more towards what's working and what isn't. And I'm just going to start by making some small sketches. So just really loose and at a small size, just trying to capture the basic shapes. So I tend to start with just a circle and then some lines indicating the angle of the head. And if you work small, you kind of have to focus on those overall shapes rather than those smaller details, right? So you have to think about the overall proportions. And that's what I think is an essential ingredient of stylized work. It's when it's more focused on the shapes and less on the accuracy of the details. So that's what works for me most of the time.
I can see we got like the thinner neck as well.
Yes. So I like to work with kind of what they call semi-realism, but like more cartoony proportions. So I like to make the head bigger, the neck smaller, and just kind of more of that Disney-ish proportion, because that just makes it a little bit more cartoony and adds like an element of fantasy. So that's something that I'm always kind of automatically adding. And I think that's something that's a lot easier to immediately build into your art when you're working on a small size, because then you're thinking about those overall shapes, right? Rather than like getting everything exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it lets you focus more on the character when you're less focused on exact proportions.
Yeah, like the personality and the readability. So that's something that I talk about a lot in my tutorials as well. Like readability is such a big part of it because you want from a distance to be able to kind of see what you're looking at. And if you're working small, then readability is easier to judge whether you're getting that right. So that's my first little sketch, just my warm up. And now I'm going to go into maybe taking a different stylistic approach. So for example, what if I created a more angular version, because I really like kind of the angularity of her eyebrows and her eyes. So what if I created another version where I'm using more angular shapes and more kind of jagged lines, just to kind of see like how that feels. And, you know, kind of changing up your stylistic approach from time to time, like from angular to round or more simplified to more complex, I think is a really great way of exploring what kind of stylistic approach feels good to you. So that also helps you to try and find like basically the stylization techniques that fit best with the way that you see things. And the only way you can find that out is by trying things out, right?
Do you typically work this way then? You do like multiple initial sketches just to get that direction?
I usually do a lot of warm-up, like loose warm-up sketches when I start out, but not really with the conscious goal of doing different stylistic techniques, but more like just to kind of get into it and land on what works for me. Because my general approach is like to only move forward with something once I get that click with it. So I look at it and I'm like, oh yeah, that feels good to me. And on one day that could be totally different than something on the next day. So sometimes I'm just way more in the mood for something more simplified or more smooth. And then the other, like another day I could want more detail and more like chunky shapes like this. So I really use like my intuition and my mood as a guide for approaching my art. And sometimes trying out different approaches is what allows you to kind of discover that, like kind of figure out where you're at. But I usually land on it in a more kind of more like subconsciously. And now I'm doing it very consciously just to demonstrate it to the audience.
I know what you mean though. Often you can just know that's the one.
You just feel it
that feels
when it
right, yeah.
works. Okay, so this is like a slightly more angular sketch, but I feel like it's a bit restrained. I feel like it's missing some movement. So I'm gonna go for another warm-up sketch. Maybe something a bit, so I'm gonna zoom out because I noticed like the more zoomed in I am on my reference image, the more likely I am to get stuck on the detail. So I'm gonna zoom out, make her quite small, and try another one. Maybe
So,
more.
Lois, as you know, we do sessions like this every week, and I find it such an honor to be able to host these and sit in on these. And I've started to draw a lot of patterns between, top artists that we collaborate with. And something I really notice is the pros spend more time planning and more time sketching and just kind of analyzing reference images and stuff. Whereas people who are a bit more beginner like to kind of enthusiastically just jump into drawing the final piece straight away. Have you noticed that as well?
Well, it really depends because I've had drawing sessions where I make like a quick sketch and then I'm like, this is it. I'm ready to go. And I just move forward without doing any variations. And then it instantly feels perfect. And then there are other times where I get more stuck on getting it right. And then it also turns out okay, but it just requires more planning because it's just like I'm not in the right flow or like everything isn't falling into place as perfectly as I would like.
Yeah.
So for me, it just varies so much from one drawing to the next. There are drawings that I made where I'm like, oh, this is one of my best, but I only spent like 3 hours on it. And then there are other drawings where I'm like, oh, that took like upwards of 20 hours to get right, you know? So for me, it's like like just a mixed bag, really.
That's reassuring to hear, though. It's like it's not always like super smooth and consistent for you either.
No, definitely not. No. It's usually just like, I don't know. I feel like it's a lot like an emotional process for me. It's very much like figuring out where I'm at and figuring out what I want. And also like what inspires you, right? Like if you discovered an artist that like super inspires you, then usually it's so much easier to create following that because the inspiration is flowing through you. And sometimes you're in like a kind of inspiration desert where you're like not really sure what to do. And then it's just kind of like, okay, I'll just try something, you know, and then things tend not to go as smoothly because you don't have as much motivation and inspiration.
Yeah.
So I'm a big proponent of just like telling people, you know, it takes however much time it takes and it's different for everyone. And not to pressure yourself to work at a certain pace or have a certain output. And another thing that I love using, so I've done this a couple times already, but I use the transform tool a lot in my sketching as well. If I feel like something isn't aligned right, or I tend to draw the face like a little too big for the head, and I just correct it with the lasso tool and just transforming it. So I just feel like if you're using digital, you got to use it to its maximum potential and just like don't get too stuck on like having it right from the first line, you know, just change it as much as you need to.
Embrace the undo feature.
Oh, yeah. I think it's interesting that like her expression is quite ambiguous or quite in the middle. And then like my versions are all sort of more smiling. Like that's kind of the twist that I'm pushing it towards, you know? And that's why I like this kind of ambiguous reference material because it's always fun to see like what will an artist do with it and what does that say about, you know, how you're feeling or what you're wanting to create. Right. And maybe I should make one more just to wrap it up because right now I think I like this one the most. But I'm just gonna make one more quick sketch where I kind of exaggerate a little bit more. Maybe kind of push everything because I feel like I'm kind of restrained at this point.
It's funny though, I can see you getting looser with each one.
Yeah, that's why it's good to do warm-ups, right? Like it's always surprising how much more you can get into the flow of it if you take the time. This brush also, like, I love it because it's just perfect for the swoopy lines, right? Like it's so nice for just getting that movement in there.
Yeah, great sketching brush.
How's everybody else doing? Are you guys drawing along?
I can tell they are, because this
Yeah.
is the point where everyone goes from being super chatty to like much quieter. And yeah, let us know in the chat. But are you watching along, I presume, and many of you following along at home?
I also always feel like every single line that you can kind of get out is a good one, you know, like even if you're feeling rusty or you're not really sure where you're going with it, it's just good to like get your lines out of your system and just kind of see how that goes. So I know a lot of people get stuck on drawing because they're like, oh, the drawing that I'm making is no good, this sketch is bad, and then they feel increasingly negative about what they're making, and then they kind of feel stuck.
Yeah.
But just think like everything you get out is fine. You know, don't be too harsh on those initial lines because you're just trying to get into the flow of it. And
Give yourself grace.
it's all, yeah, give yourself grace. It's all part of the process. You'll get there eventually.
By the way, there will very much be a replay for today, so I don't want anyone to worry if they miss a tip or something like that. You will be able to watch this back.
Okay, so now I have to make a choice. I have a couple of sketches. I have, let's see, these two, my very initial sketch. And then I think they're like very minor differences between them, but still to me, they feel big because it's more like I can just feel the energy of each one.
Which one's your favorite? I think I know which one mine is.
Oh, which one's yours?
Well, I don't want to give like a wrong answer, but I kind of like
There's no wrong answer.
The
There's no
bottom middle one is speaking to me, where it's a bit
yeah,
rounded.
with this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one's speaking to me too because I feel like it makes the best use of the face structure and the volumes.
That's nice proportions.
Yeah, I think that works a little better. And I think she's more forward facing. It feels a bit more appealing. So yeah, I think I'll work from that one. Let's see. Let's put the other ones away. And I'm just going to blow this one up. Nope. There we go. And because I worked at a small size, the details are not quite right. You know, they're quite loose. And obviously, like I use the transform tool, right? So we have a line here that just kind of disconnects from the line below it. But that's not really a big deal to me. I think it's good for sketches to be loose and to be more messy. So I'm just going to lower the opacity, and on a separate layer on top, that's where I will paint over or draw over some more detailed features on top of this construction. And personally, I think it's good to not throw away your sketch lines. So to just keep them intact. I'm going to bring up the flow of my brush a little bit so that I get more clear lines. And I'm just going to be drawing on top of my original sketch. So I really think you shouldn't throw away your initial sketch lines. If you find them to be like too messy, just lower the opacity of them, but don't toss them because they're always bringing so much energy to the drawing. Like they show your thought process and they show your initial energy that you brought into the sketch. So you don't want to get rid of that, right? Because then what you're left with is something that doesn't have that kind of appeal and energy anymore.
Lois, do you mind if I shout out any questions from the community as we go?
Not at all. Go ahead.
Cool. So a few people asking about the brushes. Just a reminder, that is in the handout, everyone. But Titanium asks, what else do you tend to look for in a reference photo, besides perhaps an ambiguous expression?
What I look for are clear silhouettes. So if you can see the outer shape of the character really well, like, or the person, and you can see like how the shapes of the body are against the background, you could essentially cut them out from the background. That I think is really important because that tells you everything about the shapes, and silhouette is extremely important when you're drawing character art. So when you have a portrait, for example, there's a lot of like moody black and white portraits with a black background, and then someone's only vaguely lit from the side, and then you don't see the silhouette of the figure. I avoid that kind of stuff. So I always make sure that I can see the overall shapes. And I always look for, I just look for something in the mood and the emotion that interests me. You know, so something that's just like too extreme doesn't resonate with me as much as something that feels very subtle. But it's really just like a mood that I'm looking for most of the time.
Perfect. And which brush are you using right now? Is this the one from the handout?
This is the Macca Labs HB pencil brush. So that's it's not
Perfect.
from my brush set. It's from a different it's from a creator that made a couple of brushes that kind of mimic traditional tools, and this one mimics the pencil, and it's my favorite.
Yeah, I think we've got a link for that as well for everyone. There's a few questions that are more mindset based, actually. Lois, if
Sure.
you're happy for me to cover those.
Yeah.
How do you get out of a rut? Julia asks. And she said this is a question for the queen herself.
How do I get out of a rut? For me, it always helps. Like, it kind of depends on the rut itself, right? Like, what is causing it. So sometimes there are moments where a rut is caused by just being out of practice or being out of the creative flow. That affects me quite a lot in my work because I make tutorials and I do a lot of stuff outside of just drawing. So when I get out of the flow of drawing, it's hard to get back into it for me. So then I have to kind of like get the creative engine going again. And it often helps for me to just create artwork like this, like stuff from reference, so that I don't have to come up with ideas. Because that for me is like the biggest kind of roadblock to creating. If I'm looking at a blank canvas and I'm like, I just don't know what to draw. Like it could be anything that I could draw and I just don't know what. And working from reference gives me some kind of starting point. And then sometimes you get into a rut because your self-esteem is bad, right? Like you maybe like I've had that when I've painted something and I just feel like it didn't turn out the way I wanted. And I'm kind of like not getting the results that I want. And you can get kind of like negative about your work. And in that case, I think it's good to just go back to the comfort zone, like to go back to the stuff that feels good and that you like know how to draw, that you have a good handle on, so that you can kind of build up that self-esteem again and kind of like get back to a point where you feel good about your work and remember how much your skills have developed. Because I think artists can get very stuck on being harsh on themselves, being negative about their, what they're capable of, and they forget to think about what they're good at and what feels good to do and what they've built up over time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another it kind of depends on what's causing it. But in general, I think going back to something that's easy and manageable has always been helpful for me personally.
Do you find walking away is often helpful? Like if you're in one of those bad mindset days, you walk away from the screen or the tablet, like get some sleep, come back with fresh eyes.
For sure. Yeah. Taking a break is sometimes really important. Although sometimes like I can, because I kind of go out of the flow of drawing. Like if I get out of the creative flow, it's good for me to get back into it as quickly as possible. So like a break is not always helpful in that case. Mm-hmm. But definitely if you find that you're like being too negative about your work, you might be looking too closely at it as well. Like you might be too much stuck on details and technicalities. And then when you walk away for a bit and you come back later, you can see the positives of your work as well. So whatever it takes to like kind of get a more objective view, right? Because in my experience, like I've heard a lot of people say that artists need more criticism, but I think that artists are too critical of themselves a lot of the time and are just like very negative on themselves, and that doesn't really boost their growth or their it doesn't create a positive environment for learning. So I think if artists are more gentle on themselves, that is actually like what I usually recommend.
That tends to be how we do things here. No criticism.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we need criticism, but sometimes we actually need the opposite. We need more support and we need to feel better about what we're capable of,
Yeah.
So that's a pattern that I see a lot.
We're really trying to have quite a public conversation at the minute around art doesn't always need to be like relentless leveling up of skills, which can feel quite pressured. It's like, what happened to just creating because it's fun and you enjoy it?
Yeah, exactly. I think that, sorry, my coffee machine just suddenly went off. I don't know if you guys can hear it. Can you hear it?
Slightly. I mean, it sounds delicious.
It chooses its own moment to rinse itself. So
I thought you were about to get a brew like mid-session. I would be very jealous.
I would not mind, but I had a bunch of coffee right before the session, so I think we're good. No, I really think that, like if you enjoy what you're doing, you like drawing, that shows more than technical skill. So
Mhm.
that's the more important thing. And also your technical skills will evolve more naturally if you enjoy what you're doing, which is another reason why it's good to get reference images that kind of like pique your attention, that make you kind of look at it and think like, hey, what do I like about this? I'm drawn to this, because that allows you to create work that you enjoy. And when you create work that you enjoy, that shows in your work and also boosts growth. So it's all
And it's
like
kind of
this.
contagious, right? We love
Yeah.
to see people, enjoying what they're doing and feeling passionate.
Yeah, people really like to see artists enjoy themselves, and it shows in the work that you create, and it shows in the growth that you experience. Like you can really tell if an artist has stumbled upon something that's allowing them to really kind of that allowed them to find their passion. Like I've seen artists online where I look at their work and I can see the moment where they discovered something that like really excited them, and it
Yeah.
shows in their overall artistic growth. So that's just a really important part of it.
Can you look for that? That's the thing. It's like, it often feels like if you're looking too hard for that thing, then it becomes elusive.
Yeah, it's true. And you need to find it at the right time. Like you can't force it. I've generally found that my own artistic development is a lot about like just stumbling upon things and discovering things I like kind of by coincidence, and then going through periods where I'm just kind of coasting on what I've discovered in the past or something that I've started doing, and I'm just kind of like staying in the flow of learning and making stuff, and then suddenly I'll stumble upon something that accelerates my creativity again, but sometimes you can't force it. It just comes and it goes.
That's quite reassuring, though. It's almost giving permission to be a little bit in your comfort zone for phases, and so
For
you don't
sure.
have to relentlessly be leaning into something new.
No, and if you force things too much, like especially forcing creativity is like, it's very unhealthy, I think. You can't like make it happen. The only thing you can do is like take good care of yourself and make sure that you're like, feeling inspired and feeling rested, and like just getting enough input as well that can then feed your creativity. Like sometimes that's all you can do rather than constantly
Yeah.
trying to push your growth.
I caught up with Flo yesterday, by the way,
Oh, cool.
who sends her best. She was like, yeah, it's going to be amazing when Lois joins you.
Oh, that's
But she was talking about, she's been moving house and all this stuff, and she's been creating less, and she kind of recognizes life has these phases where it's like, I'm going to go a bit quiet and do less, and then I'm going to be really prolific for another phase.
Yeah, that's how it goes. Like a lot of the time, I actually like asked a long time ago on about people's experiences with art block, what they call it. So like I guess like low creativity phases. And a lot of people said that their art blocks happen during times where like they were just going through a lot, like a move, or even more serious things like, like if you're in a period of grief or you're kind of burned out or those kind of things. That stuff usually can cause like a low creative period. But then artists are so rough on themselves. They're like, oh, I should be creating. But then
Yeah.
the reason that they're feeling less creative is because they need to attend to something in their lives that is more important at that moment. So that's another thing that I think is really important as an artist, is to realize that art matters a lot to us, but it shouldn't be ahead of other things, right? Like we need to balance that out with, taking care of ourselves and our lives outside of art as well. Like you can't, like artists tend to make art such an integral part of their whole personality and identity that they find it difficult to admit sometimes that it's not number one. Like it's not our main priority at every point, right? But that's okay. I think that's normal. I think we just, like it just flows in its own way.
100%. Yeah. Ernesto in the chat just went, word. I think that's being echoed by a lot of people. There were a couple of questions, by the way, about proportions. And I was curious about that because, normally if it's a like for the reference, obviously the proportions are just trying to accurately copy it over. But when you're going a bit more off piece, how do you keep the proportions really, attractive here?
So for me, I think if you have clearly defined shapes, then that is a big part of getting proportions to work. It's like thinking about how you can push certain shapes against others and create like an interesting silhouette from that. I think it's a question of experimenting and kind of finding out for yourself which proportions you personally find interesting. Like I've always been drawn the most towards like Disney-ish proportions because I really grew up admiring that style and drawing a lot of that. So that happens kind of naturally. But I think the only way that you can keep it kind of appealing, even if you're changing it and exaggerating it, is thinking about the relationships that these shapes have towards one another, right? So for example, her eyes are a lot larger than her eyes in the reference image, but it's not really about what size the eyes are. It's about how they relate in position to the nose and the mouth, for example. So it's really good to think about those relationships that they have with one another. And I think there's no like formula for making it work. I think it's just all about trying it and then seeing for yourself, like, is it working? Do I like where this is going? That's really what it comes down to. I know that's kind of a vague answer, but hopefully.
No, I mean, it makes sense, right? So you're not necessarily doing it relative to the reference. You're doing them relative to each other.
Yeah, exactly. That's like, I think the most important thing. By the way, I've created a new layer underneath the sketch that I have, and I'm just like blocking in some simple colors for now. It's just really just a skin color and the hair color. And one thing that I think is really important about color, like my main advice that I can give is to start with one color. So I have this kind of beigeish color, beigey, and I'm just selecting parts of it and using the hue saturation window to just kind of somewhat slightly adjust the colors from the base. And I think when people get overwhelmed by color, a lot of the time it's because you're just tossing a lot of colors down and then kind of fighting with it, trying to make it work. But I think if you start from one color and very slowly kind of divert from that main color, that it's a lot easier to make it feel more unified. So that's what I'm doing here.
That's a really good tip, actually.
Yeah, I think with color, you can just keep things pretty simple, and then it can still work, essentially. Another thing that I think is really important about color is like something that I do in any workflow of mine, from simple digital sketch to painting, is that I set the sketch. So the sketches, like I kept my original sketch in there, right? So I have a more detailed sketch, but I still have my original sketch underneath, and those lines are kind of showing through. And I think it's really important to keep them. And then I set them to multiply over the color layer. And I will then change the colors of the lines. So I'm going to click on colorize in the hue saturation window, but there are all different kinds of ways to do that depending on the software you're using. And I'm going to change the colors of these lines to something maybe like reddish or brownish to kind of mix with the base colors that I put down. And what you get from this is it just feels more unified, right? So if I have this more brownish color for the lines, it just blends with the colors below so much better. It just feels more together. But another thing that I really love about this is that there are now all these intermediate colors because I set it to multiply, which means that it's blending on the base color below. And we not only have the color of the lines here, but for example, on the darker color, the lines are even darker as well. And then there are also like kind of these new kind of mid-tones that come up from the softer lines. So we get like we introduce like a bunch of new colors to the image just by setting the lines to multiply and changing the color. So it's something that I find incredibly helpful. And I do that in all my digital art workflows. And I'm also going to introduce just a little bit of skin tone variation. So just some warmer colors around the cheeks, around the nose.
This is so insightful, by the way, because I've always wondered how your colors felt so cohesive. And you're really just working from one kind of base color and then just tweaking, values from there, right?
Yeah. And then I put some colors down. I usually just put down any random color, and then I'll just modify and adjust it as I go. So I'll just go to like selective color, for example, which is one that I really like. And I think in Procreate, color balance behaves more like selective color. Mm-hmm. So you can use color balance instead. And I'll just like kind of play around with the sliders and see what happens, if I push it in different directions, see if I can make them feel more warm or I think if you have a starting point, so my starting point is this kind of brownish hue. If you have a starting point, then you know what's working, and then you can always push that further and adapt it and adjust it towards being more vibrant, you know, but you have to know like what is your starting point and what are you trying to exaggerate and push. And that makes it a lot easier to make those kind of creative decisions. And now I'm also going to make a new multiply layer. So I created an extra layer on top of the base color, and I set that one to multiply as well. And I'm going to use that. I'm going to pick my kind of skin tone, and I'm going to use that to just block in some quick shadows. So I'm using the hard round brush from my own brush set, and you can download that as one of the handouts, I believe, here in the chat.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to kind of block in some shadows, and I'm just playing around, right? So I'm just putting something down and kind of seeing if it works.
Are you working from the reference much for the shadows, or
not that much? I usually add shadows based on like how much they can emphasize the volumes that I put down. So I'm not trying to like replicate the lighting too much. I generally find that once you start copying, or once I start copying the lighting of the image, then I lose the stylization, right? So for me, having a stylized look is so linked to focusing on shapes and volumes rather than on lighting. So that's usually the mindset that I have while blocking in the shadows. Like, how can I make these volumes look a little bit more, I don't know, like juicy or more like defined, you know? So for example, her nose, like, I'm not really trying to think about how to capture her nose exactly right. I'm just trying to really show how like it's a volume kind of protruding from the rest of the face. So can I exaggerate the shadow underneath it to push that feeling? Like how can I make those volumes look more believable, basically?
It's incredible how much this adds. I mean, it's still like quite rough brush strokes, but it's transforming it.
Yeah, it's always like the moment where the shapes kind of come to life when you're adding like a little bit of simple shading. And then if you look at it, you know, without the lines or the color, you can see that it's not the most complex shading. It's just one layer with kind of additional detail. But also because it's set to multiply and because it's a similar color to the ones already on the canvas, it feels unifying as well.
Let us know in the chat. Are you following along okay so far? Is everything making sense? And is your mind starting to just be a little bit blown, as mine is, kind of understanding Lohse's workflow like this?
And I have it on a separate layer, which means I can easily kind of play around with the colors, right? And that's always the fun part, is like kind of trying to see, you know, what if I change these shadows to blue? Would that look good? Would it be horrible? This is how I discovered this whole intuitive digital art process, because I kind of taught myself how to draw with digital art, and I learned that moving the sliders around, you can just kind of see yourself, what will happen. And that's something you can't really do with traditional, or you can, but then you have to make a new drawing every time, you know, and be like, oh, well, I'm making a new base drawing, and then I'm going to try like green shadows or blue. But if you're working digitally, you can just put them on there and kind of see yourself with the slider, what the effect is of different colors on the overall image. And it teaches you how to feel when it's right, because you just know when you see it, right? So I just go down the slider and I just think like, okay, this kind of reddish hue and pushing the saturation a little bit, that's what feels right. So that's what I'm going to do. You can just tweak the sliders until you know that it's working. And I just feel like so much of art is like, you know that it works once you see it in front of you, and digital art lets you do that.
Yeah, the old like, is that better, worse, better, worse?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now I'm going to group all of these together and I'm going to merge it. So now I have everything on one layer. So I have my sketches, my shadow, my base color, just all together. And that means that I can do like one more pass of color adjustments to kind of just see what would happen if I push it in different directions. Like, is there something I can do to make it more vibrant or to boost the contrast, for example? All right, so this is just a very mild change. And now I'm going to just kind of sculpt out the detail a little bit more. So this is a process that I call sculpting with color, which basically just means like you have your colors in front of you and now you can just like dig in. You can like just go in there and do what you want with it because you're painting on top of your drawing. So, you know, I can just like go in and, for example, you know, work on the detailing in her eyes and just paint on top. So nothing's stopping me from adding whatever detail I want to add. The sculpting with color terminology, like I explained my process once on DeviantArt and somebody said, it's like you're sculpting with color. And that stuck with me forever. I was like, that's the term. That explains exactly what I do.
I used to love DeviantArt growing up.
Yeah, that was like kind of a life-changing moment. And one thing that I like about the sculpting with color process, like now that I've kind of layered some colors on, is I have different colors at my disposal here, right? So I have some darker colors here, some lighter colors here, some more reddish tones here. So you just pick colors that are already on your canvas and kind of use those to further detail. I am going to do it on a separate layer on top. I'm still painting over, but I'm just separating the layer just in case I want to go back and change something that isn't working. So for example, now if I say like, okay, this isn't quite right, and just click it away and kind of start over. But it's not with the idea of like blending it in any kind of way. I'm still just painting on top.
Lois, I think the team mentioned you were happy to potentially go a little bit over time. Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem. For me, it's no problem if it's no problem for you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I just wanted to give everyone a heads up. Like, we're going to keep going today because this is magic.
We're going to be here for another couple of hours, so get ready. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, we forgot to mention we're doing a 24-hour live stream marathon.
Draw-a-thon, yeah.
That's why she's brewing a coffee right now, everyone.
The first of many.
How many coffees do you have per day?
I usually just stick to 4.
Okay, that's a very respectable number.
Yeah, you think? For me, like I do notice the limit of my energy. Like I just noticed that at some point the energy just turns to anxiety if it's more than 4 cups. So.
Yeah. So our CTO Darren, I think he would always exceed 10 per day, and his wife recently had to like talk him down and reduce it to about 4.
Yeah, I'm secretly so jealous of people who can drink that much coffee because I want to, you know, but I just know like I can feel that my body just doesn't react well. Like I can really just feel a moment where suddenly I'm just like so anxious and I'm like, why am I so anxious? And I'm like, oh, I've had like 5 iced coffees today. I guess that's the reason. So what I love about this kind of sculpting with color technique is that you can change things kind of as you go. So you don't have to stick exactly to the lines that you created in the early stages. You can kind of paint over it and adapt it based on, you know, what feels right. And sometimes, like what I've noticed a lot is that in the course of making stylized work, sometimes your priorities can change or the proportions can change. Like there's a lot that kind of evolves as you're drawing. And I always found that if you're just too rigid in the early stages about how it should look, in my case, like it always backfired. I wasn't able to get it quite right because everything that I did to add detail kind of pushed it away from the original, and everything that I did to stick to the original didn't feel like it was evolving the drawing. So the perfect solution that I found was to just kind of paint over the whole thing and just change it depending on what feels right at that moment, you know? So it could be that your work was more cartoony and stylized in the initial sketch, but it became less stylized as you were adding detail. And sometimes it's better to just roll with that rather than constantly fighting with your drawing and to just see where that takes you, basically. So that's why I love this kind of technique of painting over the whole thing, because then I can kind of see what the drawing needs at that stage of the drawing process. And it could just evolve so much while you're drawing.
That's really interesting. You never know what goes into people's art, do you, until they really unpack it like this?
I guess, yeah. I'm always amazed by artists who just tell their process. And it's like, I made a sketch, I added color, and then I finished it. And like the finished version looks like the sketch. I'm always like, how did they do that? You know, like I've never been able to do that. I've always just kind of like had to let go of my original, like at a very early stage of learning digital art, I really tried to have like a very neat process where I created a sketch and then I created really neat line work and each element was on a different layer. And I just like very carefully just finalized that line work. And I was always disappointed at the end. I was always like, how do I change this thing? I have to go to like layer 79. Where is that layer? You know, and I would just like fight with my drawing. So
you have to find what works for you, I guess.
Yeah, this is what works for me for sure. Like letting go of accuracy and precision and letting go of like trying to make it perfect made a huge difference to me. And I know that like there are artists who can kind of hold on to that idea of making things perfect because they're so good at executing their ideas. But I've never been that artist, and I've stopped aspiring to being that.
Do you think maybe near the end of this workshop, Les, we could just turn the layers off and kind of turn them on one by one very quickly so people get a recap almost of your process?
Yeah, that's what I was planning on doing for sure.
Oh, awesome.
Let's see. So I feel like it needs some highlights. I feel like it needs, so this has like been my kind of detailing process. I feel like we're missing a lighter color. So I'm just gonna kind of find, so one thing that I can also recommend when choosing colors is to kind of like divert from your base color a little bit. So this is my base color, and going simply to a lighter version of my base color is like the obvious choice. But sometimes it's fun to see if you could do like a more desaturated version of the base color, for example, or like a slightly different hue. Like you can just move along this slider and create like a different color entirely. But it's good to kind of play around with different hues and different levels of saturation if you're adding highlights and shadows, because that adds a little bit of interest. You know, it creates like a more interesting color scheme. So I'm just going to add highlights that are more grayish version of the base color. I think that when your colors are like super predictable, so you use the colors that you would exactly expect in a certain situation, that's kind of a missed opportunity to add, you know, a little bit of creativity, a little bit of like artistic vision. So it's always good to play around. Like for a long time, I also did portraits just with like blue skin or green skin or just totally different color highlights than you would expect. And that's always really fun because it's basically sending out a message to the viewer, like this drawing is my take on this idea. Like it's not realistic. It's like me having fun, you know, which is why I think like playing around with color is such a great opportunity to create stylized work.
That's a great tip. Artistic license, I guess, right?
Yeah, artistic license, exactly. I'm also going to break up the shadows a little bit with maybe, because the shadows are all like a warm tone, right? So maybe it'd be fun to bring in like a cooler tone inside of the shadow as well. So on a separate layer, I'm just painting in some blue. And then I'm going to bring in my hue saturation, kind of tweak that color, see if I can get something that works. Yeah, so this kind of like very soft grayish blue. I'm just going to break up the shadows with this color because I think that will add a little bit more three-dimensionality. Right.
So you don't really have a plan for the hue. You're just tweaking it, right?
No, I don't have a plan. I just kind of just play around. Like I just think like, so my whole process is basically just a problem solving process that just continues on until it's done. So when I look at the shadows before, I think like, you know, when I was first putting down the shadows, I was thinking like, I need more volume. So I'm going to put down shadows. And then once you have the shadows, you can think about the next issue, right? So now that I have them, I can think like, okay, but the shadows are feeling a bit monochromatic. Like they're lacking color variation. So now I can add a little bit of color variation inside those shadows. And then once you add that, you can think about the next step, which is like, okay, maybe I could add a little bit more contrast in certain parts of the face, or maybe I could distribute this color in other parts of the drawing as well. And it's like every time that you take a step, like a creative step, it kind of opens the door to taking the next creative step, because you can see what your drawing needs. You can see what you could use to boost it once you have it in front of you. And then like my mind just starts thinking like, okay, what can I add? How can I push this further? And it's that constant process of doing that. Indeed, without a plan, I just kind of I know what it needs when I see it in front of me, basically.
And how do you know when to stop adding?
Yeah, that's when time runs out usually. Honestly, like it helps me a lot to just set a time limit on how long I'm going to spend. And yeah, also just once there's always a point where you're drawing and then your drawing isn't getting any better. It's only getting like more detailed or more complex, but not improving. So I think it's very important to be honest with yourself when the drawing is not really improving or you're just kind of stuck. Okay, so for the last thing I'm going to do is add some feathered lasso tool. So I merge everything together. And with the feathered lasso tool, I'm just going to like select some parts of the face and kind of boost the color in that area. So make her cheeks a bit redder. This is something that I always do just to make the skin look more alive, to really make it look like the blood is flowing and make them look more vibrant.
Is there a reason why you use like the feathered lasso tool instead of filling a layer with, you know, like a bump in saturation, masking it, and then kind of painting back in those areas?
I think both could work. It really depends. Like there's so many different ways to get like subtle color variation at the final stage of your drawing, and feathered lasso tool is like my fastest technique. But you could also indeed like you could create like an overlay layer, for example, or you could indeed like duplicate it and change it. So it's any way that works for you. But the end goal is just to get a little bit of a color boost in the skin. And that's another thing that I love about digital art. There's usually a gazillion different ways to get the same end result. And you just got to find the one that like feels best to you, like the easiest shortcut or whatever you're used to using.
I mean, that was super efficient how you did it. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it also is great for like adding a little bit of, you know, like for example, I can select some parts of the hair and then bring in my levels and like darken them, for example. So there's all different kinds of things that you can do with the lasso tool being set to a feathered edge. I believe in Procreate, it's not feathered. It has a different name, but there's like a slider that allows you to blur the edges of the selection. But it's like
help us out, community. I'm drawing a blank as well.
Yeah. I usually remember it off the top of my head. Is it feathered? Oh, it could be feather. All right, so I'm going to
it is feather. That's why. Yeah.
I'm going to run you through how it went from beginning to end. Let's see. So we started with these kind of warm-up sketches. So all these like smaller sketches, each one like with minor differences from the next one, just kind of trying to find the one that feels right. And then I picked one of those sketches and made it a bit larger. And then on top of that, I added more detailed sketch. And the really important part about that is that I didn't throw away my original sketch. Because if I get rid of my original sketch, you can see that there's just a lot of life, a lot of volume, a lot of energy missing in the end result. So I like to have both of them there. And then once I have my sketch, which is the combination of more detailed with my initial rough sketch, I duplicate that. Like I duplicate it on a new layer, merge it together, and then I add some base colors to that, some shadows, and I make sure that those lines have a color to them so that they're set to multiply and that the color is somewhat modified so that we don't have black lines, because that brings so much more three-dimensionality to the color scheme. It just makes everything more unified, a lot softer, and it brings new colors to the color scheme.
And to clarify, that is the duplicated line art.
Yeah,
where you're tweaking it.
Yeah. So I do this thing throughout my whole process that I call just group, duplicate, and merge. So I group it, I double the group, like so I have two of them, and then I merge the top one, because then I can always go back to my old version. So I can always say, like, if this isn't working, I can go back to my separated lines and start over from there. So my use of layers is more like a timeline. Like I always just have my latest version of the drawing at the top and my older versions below. Which
that's interesting. It's like the time machine on Mac.
Yeah, I don't really bother to name them. So like group 4 is now my starting point, and group 2 is don't even bother looking at their names.
It's like Star Wars or something like that.
Yeah, it's all about whichever one is on top. The top layer is the most recent version, basically. And then I merge that all together and kind of make some mild color adjustments. So you can see just like some very subtle color adjustments. And then from there, I will add some detailing on top of the merged layer. So you can see here, this is where I started. And this is like a first pass of adding more detail. And then here are some highlights, and here are some adjustments to the shadows to kind of break up the shadow colors. But that's kind of like how the workflow progressed from initial sketch to basically this version. Oh yeah, and then I used the feathered lasso tool to kind of boost the skin tones a bit and the levels in some areas. And that's how we moved from this initial sketch to this kind of color version.
Wow. I was just taking notes on all of that, and that is such a cool process.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that the reason why I like to share this process is because I just think that it shows that I kind of just go with the flow and just kind of see at each stage what to do. Like I had no idea what I was going to do when I started out, just knew that I had my reference picture, and I just kind of like take it step by step and just see where it leads. And I think that's why I want people to kind of try out this workflow and maybe make adjustments to it based on their own way of working. But I really do feel like there's so much added value in just taking it step by step and not really having too clear of an idea how it should look, but just thinking about where it will go on its own and just solving problems as they arise, rather than thinking about them all in advance, which can be really paralyzing.
This has been a really refreshing session, though. Like really, really chilled energy, and watching you work, I think I didn't necessarily realize quite how free you were with how you worked, and you're not really like limiting yourself. You know, it seems like a very enjoyable process. It's not rigid at all.
Thank you. Yeah, that's how, I mean, if everything goes well, that's how it feels to me as well. Although sometimes I'm really fighting with my drawing. Like sometimes I try to solve problems as they arise, but sometimes it's like one problem after the next, and I feel like I'm not getting it under control. So sometimes it can be like chaotic, but to me, this is a workflow that it just feels like the least planning is needed, and like I don't really need to get stuck on anything. Like I can just kind of see where it goes. And when I'm making digital paintings, I basically use this exact workflow, but I just put like way more hours into it, and like have to solve many more issues because there's like usually more design elements included. But this general workflow, I think, is just super applicable, to quick sketches, but also to more detailed works. And I just really recommend it.
Yeah, this was incredible. And I don't know if you saw the chat at all.
Yeah, I saw some things come by.
Yeah,
I wish I could have read everything, but I had to split my concentration a little.
I mean, I think
it was
there's
really great.
been about 10,000 comments, so, so like literally. Can everyone please give it up for Lois though, because that was incredible. And yeah, I've been reading so many of your comments throughout. Like the energy has been incredible. I think people really appreciate seeing like under the hood of your process, to be honest, and just a deeper understanding of how you work. And alongside that, I think you just bring so much care and empathy to everything you do, and that really comes across. So like not only are you prolific as an artist and a lot of people look up to you, but I think you make yourself very approachable, and people are able to kind of feel like you're also in their shoes with some of the struggles and the mindset stuff. So thank you for just being such an incredible champion for creatives everywhere. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks so much to the community for being so supportive. These things always give me a huge boost as well, just seeing how many kind words are being shared. So thank you to everybody who joined, and thank you for having me.
Of course. Yeah, this was amazing, and hopefully we'll catch up soon. But thank you again. And just a reminder to everyone, the replay will be available for this session, because I know a lot of you are going to want to watch this back. But Lois, thank you so much for your time again. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Take care.